My name is Irina von Wiese. I'm a former MEP for Renew Europe. I am now an academic teaching law and politics at the ESCP, not to be mixed up with the ECPS. The ESCP is a European business school based in Paris and other European cities where I teach, and I am the honorary chair of the ECPS, which is the European Center for Populism Studies. I took up this role after I left the European Parliament, and it's been a true pleasure and honor to chair this think tank and institute, about which you will hear a little bit more later on this afternoon. We are here to talk about populism, Trump, and changing transatlantic relations, and believe it or not, this report was started a long time ago, and little would we have known how incredibly relevant it would be on the date of its launch. And I dare say it will stay relevant for quite a long time to come. Now, I live in central London, and from my flat balcony, I can see soon the cranes of a new building rising across the river from me. And that is the new Chinese super embassy. Those of you who follow UK news will have seen that it was subject to quite a lot of controversy. Why is that relevant to our meeting today? Well, maybe because it is a sign of a geopolitical seismic shift that we are experiencing today, where a lot of European powers certainly feel that they are squeezed from both sides and that they now have to hedge their bets between the two new superpowers that are increasingly carving out their spheres of influence. But I don't want to get ahead of myself because we have a lot of speakers here today on the panel, and we're hoping also for discussions. We also have remarks from the contributors to this very good report. Before I pass to MEP Kanev, who is kindly hosting us today, I would like to introduce a special guest whom many of you will know, because he was an MEP for a lot longer than me, probably over 20 times as long as I was an MEP. And he's also my predecessor as honorary chair of the European Center for Populism Studies. Sir Graham Watson, over to you.
Thank you, Irina. Yes, I was here for 20 years, which is more than you get for murder these days. Look, I don't really know why I'm on this platform other than being the founding president, so I will be very brief. We're delighted to have with us Valerie Hayer and Radan Kanev to launch this report. Their support has been superb, and their role in standing up against populism is crucial. Do you know right now, in the building over there, there is a conference of Europe's populists going on. These people are trying to do to Europe what Trump is doing to America, and we have to stop them. And we've got to stop them by making sure we work with other political entities based on the values of democracy and the rule of law and structured cooperation, countries like Canada, South Korea, and others. We cannot do it if we reject a trade agreement with the United States one day, a trade agreement which deserved to be rejected because it was unfair, but then the following day we refer a trade agreement with another set of countries, Mercosur, to the Court of Justice. We have to de-risk from our relations with populist-based governments. One of the ways to do that is to work to the governments of countries like Brazil and Argentina to take it forward. Anyway, that's not what this report is about. This report is much more specific on what is the challenge and what policymakers need to do. And I'm just delighted to be here with others to commend it to you.
Thank you, Graham, and we are delighted to have you. Without further ado, I would like to pass the word to MEP Radan Kanev, my former colleague, and thank you for hosting us today.
Now, let me first thank you very much and very sincerely for the honor of hosting this really important and extremely timely, as you said. event, and thank very much Valerie and our colleague Brando Benifei, who's going to join us later, I guess, who are also taking part in the event and thus showing the cross-party character of our meeting. And I will open with the opening words of the very report that we are presenting, that maybe in a situation like this, domestic politics matters more than international foreign policy. And I would say even, in my view, it's more Europe's domestic policy and the link between Europe's domestic policy and the US leadership that matters most in this situation. And I can't help but start with the situation in my home country, where presently 3 strong men, the notorious oligarch Deliampevsky, the dominant figure of Bulgarian politics for 20 years, Mr. Borisov, and the freshly resigned, turned to political leader, ex-president Mr. Radev, are, let's say, competing for the heart of Mr. Trump, very openly. And in this competition, they went so far as to have the already resigned pro-European Prime Minister of Bulgaria, Mr. Zhelyazkov, sign the so-called Charter of the Board of Peace, being the only one, along with Orban, to represent the European Union. So on a number of European leaders that we could call right-wing populists, etc., still we only have 2 to sign the charter, and one of them is an EPP representative, I must admit, and not part of the parties that we usually position to the extreme. And if it were simply populism, I would say I wouldn't be too troubled, because my country has been governed by populists for the best of the last quarter of a century. And what this means for the whole period of my rather long already political career. And populism, both on the left and on the right, and I would even say the centrist populism, the centrist anti-establishment populist movements are on the rise everywhere. So we shouldn't be basically extremely concerned to see populist parties rising, because it's obviously an inevitable tendency that a year ago we had the occasion to consider in quite into depth. But I think what is happening is much more serious than simply populist messages in politics for Europe. And I feel the need to give my answer, my humble answer, what is indeed happening. And I think we must first admit some obvious facts that we don't used to admit usually. First, every Republican president of the US is right-wing populist for the European taste. We never called them like this, but we always felt like this. And second, every American president is to some degree a populist for the European taste, at least after Andrew Jackson, and that was quite long ago. Furthermore, the US foreign policy approaches have always been hard to accept on this side of the ocean. Well before Iraq in 2003, and certainly after that. And yet, Trump is very, very different. By admitting all these facts, we have also to understand why, both in the US and outside, especially for us, this is a so different situation. And frankly, I don't think it is because he's right-wing populist, and it's not even because he is authoritarian at home, and certainly not because he's arrogant and aggressive abroad, because that's how many in Europe, although not me, frankly, have always perceived the US leaders. So what is, I reiterate, the difference here? I guess that European leaders could have lived quite well with what Trump is doing at home, although we see that it is detrimental to the American institutions. I would even suppose that EU leaders could have borne the street racket style in the transatlantic relations, And in fact, both Ms. von der Leyen and Mr. Rutte have done it several times. In the already mentioned trade negotiations, for example, and in many security matters. What, in my view, is really extremely different is the type of meddling in Europe's internal affairs that we are witnessing. Because you know, let's get back to the rather uncomfortable truths that we know. The US has always, sometimes openly supported the so-called their son of bitches in many places, but never in Europe. And they have always built some networks of rather unsavory client states, but not in Europe, yet again. Quite on the contrary. In Europe, US has always supported democracy, market economy, free trade, and above anything else, US has always supported European integration. I come from a country which could have never been adopted in the EU without the pressure of the American administration. And it's a well-known fact in Western Europe and on the Balkans. Both Bulgaria and Romania were adopted in the EU mostly because of the strong pressure of the US that these countries are essential for the European project. So we are somehow, our membership is somehow the, let's say, legacy of the fact that America has always strived for united Europe. Maybe within the Pax Americana, Europe was a client of a kind. But it was an ally and not a dependency. And I think deliberately it has always to look better than the dominant power in the partnership, to be even more reputable, and always to be united. And now, that has really essentially changed. It became really the contrary as US policy towards Europe. The present US administration is openly working for the disunion of Europe and for its transformation into an insecure space of unstable client projects. Something that we've seen in South America, but never in Europe, never in the transatlantic relationships. And you know, I wouldn't put too strong an accent on ideology and values, because thus I'll be implying that Mr. Trump has some of either. I'm also deeply convinced that the majority of European leaders aligning with the Trumpist view for disunited Europe have no real conservative or nationalist values. They are covering personal authoritarian ambitions or simply corruption behind national security, economic efficiency, and conservative ideology. And they are obviously ready to play someone's SOBs and in fact degrade their nation's security and standing to achieve personal goals. It is now clear, as the report states on numerous places, that the Trumpist policy poses new challenges for both transatlantic relations and Europe's domestic policies, especially security and trade policy. And it's on national level, it's on the so-called Brussels level, it's also on pan-European level, including Norway, UK, even Canada. And it's obvious that these challenges require strong unity in Europe. I would go a bit further. I would say unity beyond ideological cleavages. And I would close with a challenge which I didn't see mentioned in the report. It's the challenge to Europe's right-wing, nationalist, conservative, and populist movements themselves. And I have a few questions. Can we imagine a French patriot or conservative, very sorry for the expression, kissing his ass? I'm only citing the leader of the free world. I think it cannot happen. It's quite the opposite for what French patriotism and French conservatism has always stand. Could a Nordic sovereignist and Eurosceptic agree to concede Greenland to the US? Obviously not. Is it possible for an Eastern European nationalist to support the Russian aggression against an Eastern European nation state or praise a peace plan, which is nothing more than giving the aggressor whatever he needs. How could any patriot from any state accept his government to be part of board of peace, which is literally a personalistic project of a foreign leader? I think very soon the real cleavage will not be based on ideas and values, and what even be sovereignists against globalists or federalists, but it will be between those who are ready to see the continent as disunited and chaotic sphere of influences. Here my team tried to correct me and said it's a sphere of influence. But no, I insist on the plural because it won't be one influence. The Chinese stand ready, the Russians stand ready, the Turkish stand ready to take part. So it will be a sphere of many foreign influences. And those on the other side who understand that European solidarity is a matter of mere security and prosperity and not of imported culture wars. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Radan, for these insightful words. And now I have the great pleasure of welcoming Valérie Hayer. She needs no introduction. She's, of course, the chair of my former political group, Renew Europe. And we're very, very glad that you could come to join us here in our cross-party panel. Valérie, over to you.
Thank you, Irena. Thank you. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to see you again, Irena and Graham, today. And thank you for this report, which is very important. I would like to thank Radan. Thank you very much for inviting me. The topic we discussed today is of primary importance. So thank you very much. And I appreciate your invitation even more, Radan, as I have just returned from Bulgaria, as you know, where I met with some colleagues of my group, civil society, journalists, proponents of an independent judiciary and the authorities. And as you said, there, an oligarch named Dylan Pevsky, with the complacency of a few politicians, is undermining the rule of law as much as, if not more than, I should go there, if not more than the current US president in his own country. You know, we know that, like in Bulgaria, attacks on democracy are increasing around the world, including the United States, the land of freedom. The return of populism to the center of American power is not simply a domestic event. It is a transatlantic shockwave. It affects European policies, European democracies, and Europe's place in the world. Today, I would like to reflect on what populism in the US means for Europe, how it operates, whom it targets, and above all, how Europeans must respond. To understand the implication for Europe, we must first be clear about what Trumpism is and what it is not. Trump's election in 2016 was widely interpreted in Europe as an accident, an anomaly driven by protest voting and frustration with political elites. European leaders largely assumed that American institutions would absorb the shock and restore equilibrium. Trump's victory in 2024 destroyed that assumption. It was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. Trump returned to power with a consolidated movement, ideological coherence, a near total control over the Republican Party. MAGA was no longer a disruptive force at the margins. It had become the core of American conservatism. For Europeans, this difference matters enormously. The second Trump presidency demonstrates that populism in the United States is not temporary. It is, as you mentioned, structural, resilient, and capable of returning even after electoral defeat. And crucially, this project is not directed against Europeans as such. This point, I think, is essential for Europeans to understand. The current US administration and the broader Trumpist movement are not hostile to Europe as a continent or civilization. They are hostile to liberals, to Democrats, to moderates, to pluralists, wherever they are. Trumpism does not oppose Europe. It opposes liberal Europe. This explains the paradox many of us still misunderstand. Trump and his movement are often closer to European far-right parties than to half of their own citizens. Ideologically, Trumpism has more affinity with the AfD in Germany or the National Rally in France than with American Democrats or even moderate Republicans. This is why Trump attacks European leaders who defend liberal democracy, while praising or embracing those who share his populist, nationalist, and illiberal worldview. In this regard, he dislikes the idea of a strong, unified Europe, capable of acting together as a geopolitical actor because it challenges the United States' dominance and complicates his transactional style of international relations. This ideological divide was fully exposed on January 6, 2021. The assault on the US Capitol was not merely a security breach. It was a test of democratic loyalty. Those who condemned it defended liberal democracy. Those who minimized or justified it revealed their priorities. The fact that Trump returned to power despite January 6 sends a powerful signal, not only to Americans, but to populists worldwide. Challenging democratic norms is politically survivable. This reinforces illiberal actors in Europe as much as in the United States. And the first norm they challenge is truth. We all see it. Trump's governance is marked by profound contradictions. He claims to defend law and order while attacking judges and prosecutors. He claims to support protesters in Iran while assaulting his people calling for democracy into his own streets. He claims to fight drug trafficking while pardoning Honduran ex-president Juan Orlando Hernandez, who helped smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine to the US. He denounces corruption while rewarding loyalty over legality. These are not inconsistencies. They are the hallmark of transactional populism, where ideology and loyalty matter more than institutions and rules. This model destabilizes alliances because it replaces predictability with improvisation and values with deals. And this logic extends directly to foreign policy. Trump's hostility toward the European Union is not only economic or strategic, it is ideological. The EU represents regulation, multilateralism, minority protections, climate policy, judicial independence. In short, everything Trumpism defines as liberal overreach. This is why EU laws are attacked as illegitimate constraints. Greenland is treated as a negotiable asset. European leaders are divided into friends and enemies based on ideology and not nationality. Trump does not ask whether a leader is European. He asks whether they are liberal or populist. Faced with this reality, Europe must respond strategically, not emotionally. First, realism. Europeans don't vote in US elections. We can't determine American political outcomes. But it doesn't mean we are powerless. It means we must focus on how we react, not on what we cannot control. We have been able to make bold decisions. We adopted the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, to protect our companies from carbon leakage and unfair competition. We passed the Digital Services and Digital Market Act to govern tech giants and tackle disinformation. Those laws were needed to ensure our sovereignty in an increasingly hostile world. Nevertheless, Europe's first mistake was complacency after Joe Biden's election. Many of us assumed Trumpism was defeated and that the transatlantic relationship had been restored once for all. It partly explains why we have not been fast enough. European countries delayed investments in autonomy and resilience, such as in the defense sector. Our budgetary rules are so complex that we disbursed less than 400 billion of euros of the recovery plan today, while it was launched in 2021. The capital market union is not achieved, and the single market is still full of internal barriers. A second, more difficult lesson is this. The current US administration understands only the language of force and leverage. This does not mean violence. It means credibility, firmness, and consequences. When Europe showed resolve by holding firm on trade leverage with the discussion on the activation of the anti-coercion mechanism, by signaling security commitments and deterrence were needed, the tone changed. When Europe hesitated or looked for appeasement, pressure increased. The episode around Greenland illustrated this clearly. Rhetorical provocation met a firm European stance, legal, diplomatic, and strategic. Not escalation, but dissuasion. Not submission, but resolve. With Trumpism, cooperation does not emerge from goodwill. It emerged from clear red line. This is why European independence is no longer optional. Europe is not weak, but dependencies create weakness. If Trump speaks of liberation, Europe needs its own acts of liberation. On technological sovereignty to prevent political use of dependence. On ecological transition, not only for climate, but for energy security and geopolitical autonomy. On European defense, of course, with credible capabilities that make deterrence real, not rhetorical. This also implies pursuing European preference in strategic public procurement to ensure we master the destiny of our industries and our economy. We are the home of key industries and companies. In the defense sector, we can rely on Airbus, Leonardo, Thales, Rheinmetall, Naval Group. In the energy sector, we can count on many national champions. In the tech sector, Europe is home to ASML, SAP, Nokia, Ericsson, and it needs to foster further the emergence of tech leaders that the world cannot live without. And I could mention many more, such as Siemens, Alstom, Maersk, BioNTech, Novo Nordisk, BASF, Solvay, for example. Europe is not poor in strategic companies. Its weakness is fragmentation, underinvestment, and political hesitation, not lack of assets. Strategic autonomy does not require inventing everything from scratch. It requires protecting, coordinating, diversifying via trade partnerships, and scaling what already exists. Yet, the most decisive battlefield is internal. If we cannot prevent populism in the United States, we can prevent it from governing Europe. Because you do not need to hold a PhD in economics to understand that the policy agenda of populists in Europe is incompatible with European sovereignty and independence, as you mentioned, Radan. And here, clarity is required. European politicians such as Jordan Bardella, calling Trump's re-election a wind of liberty and confirming his attendance to the CPAC before cancelling due to Steve Bannon's Nazi salute. And by the way, as you mentioned, Graham, Jordan Bardella might have changed his speech recently, but acts matter more than words. And indeed, right now, as we speak, who is Jordan Bardella's parliamentary groups welcoming into his parliament? The Heritage Foundation, the same think tank that wrote Trump's political program. That is the truth about these populists. They are not pro-Europeans. They are certainly not patriots. They are the Trojan horse of the MAGA movement. Giorgia Meloni, attending Trump's inauguration and criticizing European firmness on Greenland, while her ECR group in this parliament maintains a consistently favorable stance toward the US administration. Alice Weidel, co-leader of the AfD, praising Donald Trump as a model of patriotic leadership and presenting the AfD as a European counterpart to Trumpism. They are not neutral observers. They are ideological allies. They support Trump not despite his actions, but because of them. And this creates a moral challenge for European citizens. You cannot be outraged by the raids of ICE, attacks on judges, or assaults on journalists in the United States, and then vote for the same ideological project in Europe. Trumpism is not an American export imposed on Europe. It survives here only if we legitimize it. Therefore, the highest responsibility of European citizens today is to vote with a full understanding of the consequences in each upcoming election. And if I may, please let me add to these politicians I mentioned Janez Janša, former Prime Minister of Slovenia, to the list I mentioned just before. The EPP group is traveling to the country this week to endorse him again for the upcoming elections, while he repeatedly praised Trump's leadership style, amplifies his narratives on social media, and promotes an illiberal vision of democracy. And this is a risk I see today. The shift from moderate right-wing factions toward populism. It can't happen, and all the leaders in this parliament have a responsibility in this regard. You know, Trump was partly elected because people believed he would lower egg prices. Not only did he not manage to do so, but in the end, they got a president who violently arrested and let American citizens be killed in the streets and jeopardized the territorial integrity of their closest historical allies. So finally, resistance is not enough. Europe must assert itself ideologically. We are not weak, we are disorganized. The European way of life, pluralism, social protection, rule of law, dignity, is not outdated. It is powerful. It must be defended with confidence and not apologize. European culture, democratic history, and social achievements are not liabilities. They are our strongest answer to populism. In a nutshell, and I will now conclude, US populism is not a rejection of Europe. It is a rejection of liberal democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. But if Europe cannot change American elections, it can defend its values, reinforce its power, and choose its future. The question is not whether populism exists. The question is whether Europeans allow it to govern them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valérie. And I know that you have to leave us at 3:30, so if I don't get a chance later, just to say thank you, both of you, of course, for your continued fight here within the European Parliament. We couldn't do it without you here. So thank you so much for joining us today. And this leaves me to come to the main event of today, which is the launch of our annual report entitled Populism, Trump, and Changing Transatlantic Relations. We're very lucky to have three of the editors here with us today. Before I introduce them, just a quick word on the report. There should be hard copies available somewhere, but you can certainly find the report on our ECPS website. So if you haven't looked at it, please do read it. It makes for really, really fascinating reading, because the perspective that it takes is slightly different from the geopolitical perspective which we often have, because it links back to national populism. This project was achieved by the ECPS in collaboration with the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana, Champaign, ICS at the University of California, Berkeley, the European Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and ARENA at the University of Oslo. The report is partially funded by the European Commission Jean Monnet Tandem Project and Transat Defense Project. So thank you to all of those institutions. And I'm very pleased.
Yeah, I think
he's with us. Yeah. I am so happy
I was there.
Thank you very much, MEP Benifei, joining us. And I know you have to leave at 4, so I would be very, very grateful if you would keep your remarks short, if that is possible.
They asked me to speak now. That's what I was told.
That's even better. At this point, we will come back to the editors who are going to introduce parts of the report in more detail. But Brando, we're really, really happy to have you. And MEP Brando Benifei, most of you will know, is the chair of the delegation for relations with the United States. So who could better be positioned to comment? Thank you, Brando.
Thank you very much. No, the reason why we had to anticipate, I apologize, is because I have to do a meeting later with the ambassador of the EU to the US. So in fact, it's a day full of discussion on this. But I want to thank especially colleague Radan, Kanev and Valerie Ayer for having convened this meeting with the ECPS. It's a very important report. I anticipate to you that it will be very interesting in analyzing especially 4 pillars that are challenged by the situation of today: security, commerce, international institutions, and democratic values. But it will be explained by those that have written and worked on them. I am myself the chair of the delegation for relations with the United States of the European Parliament. I'm very often in US and working with the US counterparts. I see in the room some friends from American think tanks also, and I'm happy that we have this occasion of exchange also here in our House of Democracy, the European Parliament. I think that the 3 scenarios that the report will show, so the possible disintegration of the transatlantic relation, the functional adaptation or the reorganization on new bases are all possible in this very complex moment. I want to be clear with you on one point, coming from my experience, to put it on the table for this discussion. And I'm sorry that I can't be with you all the time today, because it will be a great discussion. But what I experienced in my work in the last months, discussing with the US administration and members of Congress and various kinds of representatives, is that we need to be taken seriously. European Union and the European countries need to be clear on what they think. They must be they must make their mind, they must be united, but then they have to do what they say. Because what we have seen in the last year, sometimes it has been too much of saying and then retracting and declaring and then not doing. And this has given many interlocutors I met and I meet in the US and beyond the message that the EU is not serious about its intentions. So I think we need to be constructive. I adhere to the view that I get from especially many members of Congress that we should not overreact to everyday speeches or truths or whatever. But it's also a fact that we have seen sometimes words turning into action that has created the need for some reaction. I was hearing, for example, from colleague Ayer, the reference to our work on the digital legislation, on our own legislative sovereignty. I think this is very important, that we stay firm on this. I didn't appreciate that even in these last weeks, in some formal meetings we had here, I heard from American counterparts that we should change DSA and DMA. Even the laws were named, not even a generic reference. So I think this is not the way forward, and I think that the EU should stand firm, because, and I conclude on this, if we want to deal with populism and the future of transatlantic relations, I think we need to be clear on what we stand for, on what kind of Europe we want. And I'm very biased on this, and I conclude on this very biased point. I think what Mario Draghi said yesterday at getting this honorary degree at the University of Leuven is right. This is very much my personal opinion, that the EU time of being a loose confederation is ended if we want to have a future for Europe. There must be a different way of organizing ourselves and of building a European sovereignty that can, in a condition of I don't know if parity, maybe it's too much, but in a condition of respect with the American superpower, can present its point of view in a better way than today, where we are in a difficult position. I will mention as a final point to remember, as also commerce will be dealt with, and I'm working a lot on the commerce aspects, that not me, but the Director General of the European Commission dealing with trade, so the highest person working on the deal with the US, has said clearly this was not a deal like the other deals, you know, India, Mercosur, that we have been working on. It's a deal entrenched in political priorities and issues that are far away from commerce. They deal with security, they deal with a more articulate economic intertwining. So I think that when there is such a political degree, and maybe even historical, we can see, of a relation, Europe needs to be strong if it wants to be on an equal means. And so I think this is something we will need to continue discussing, and this report helps us look into where we are and where we could go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brando, particularly for coming in when you are in between such really important meetings. I have to say, I'm not sure I envy you for your position as chair of the US delegation. I can only imagine the type of debates and a lot of issues that you touched upon we have discussed at great length within the Institute and elsewhere, notably the weaponization of trade. A lot more that could be said. Hopefully we will continue this really interesting debate. Alas, we don't have time today to do this because it is now actually time to hand over to the editors of our report, which I already started talking a little bit about the report. We have here present, I don't know in which order you would like to speak, Marianne Ridderford, who is a research professor at ARENA, the Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo, and at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. She's also a senior fellow at the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, dear members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, thank you all for being here, and especially thanks to Radan Kanev for hosting us, of course, and also for giving us this opportunity to come here today to present our findings from this report. I also want to thank Sir Graham Watson and MIP Valerie Heyer and Brando Fenife for sharing their perspectives and contributing to the debate, and also hopefully using and drawing on the insights from this report. And of course also to ASSIS and the ECPS for inviting us to put together this report, and not least to the authors. Some of them are here, Ricardo Alcaro and Mike Smith are here with us, so, and others as well, so thank you. In 2018 already, John Peterson wrote that the future of US-European relations and the liberal order at large depends less than we might expect on what the US or Europe do in foreign policy. What really matters is domestic democratic politics in Europe and America. And with Donald Trump's re-election in 2024, it seems he couldn't be more right. News headlines are, of course, we see that every day, dominated by stories of Trump policies that seem to shock the very basis of the transatlantic relationship, whether it's linked to tariffs, to Ukraine, international treaties, voting in the UN, the future of NATO, discussions on free speech, where Trump and Vance, amongst others, have a somewhat different perspective than most Europeans. And most recently escalating with Trump threatening to annex parts of NATO allies' territory. But at the same time, and after more than 8 decades of close cooperation, no regions of the world are as closely interconnected today as Europe and North America. And we know that the transatlantic relationship has survived crisis before, sometimes even coming out stronger in the end. So what we wanted to do with this report then was to ask, how can we make sense of all that is going on? How is right-wing populism under Trump affecting transatlantic relations? Is it really different this time? Are we seeing a more serious and long-term rupture of our relationship that for so long has been taken more or less as granted in Europe? And what we want to do in the report then is to try to take a step back from the everyday events that dominate the news cycle to more systematically address these questions. And we are very proud to have put together a wide number of top experts on transatlantic relations who all draw on their extensive studies to give brief, focused analysis of how the relationship is changing under Trump and what these changes imply for Europe. So to give you a summary of some of our findings and recommendations in the next, we're giving 45 minutes, so I'm not sure if we still have that, but 40 minutes or so, and please let us know if we need to stop before that. I will first present how we have organized the report in line with the 4 pillars that have constituted the post-war transatlantic relationship, namely security, trade, international institutions, and values. And very briefly present some overall key findings and recommendations, and also some of the findings and recommendations in the security and defense domain. And then Guri Rosen will do the same for trade and transatlantic relations in international institutions. And Jessica Greenberg will end by discussing the values section of the report and draw some overall conclusions. Yes. So in our report, to do this more systematically, we draw on Eikenberry to argue to what he refers to as the Atlantic Order has been built on 4 foundational interlinked pillars established, as we all know, under US lead after the Second World War. It's security alliances, the first pillar, the second is trade and finance, the third is multilateral institutions and rules, and the fourth is also liberal democratic norms. And Eikenberry also identifies 2 mutually beneficial bargains that used to underpin the transatlantic relationship. So what he calls the realist bargain involved Europe accepting US leadership, because we have done so for many decades now, in exchange for security protection and access to US markets, technology, and resources within an open world economy, which has also then, of course, resulted in a very strong trade and financial relationship. The liberal bargain involved Europe accepting US leadership in exchange for security protection and access to markets, yes. And all of these things have then been institutionalized in NATO and also within the World Trade Organization, and the EU and the US are now each other's strongest or most closely linked trade and investment partners. Third, while security and trade are the 2 first pillars, transatlantic relations have also formed the very core of what is often referred to the liberal or multilateral liberal order. By this we mean the system of international cooperation within the UN and other international organizations built under US leadership after World War II. And lastly, and this is it's very evident in the debate today, but maybe sometimes overlooked in the news cycle and the broader debate, the fact that the transatlantic relationship has always been strong because it was not only based on strategic and economic interests, but also on a shared liberal democratic value base that is sometimes referred to as the Pax Americana. And even in security, the relationship has not only been a security alliance, it has been a security community. And this has made it much stronger than if resting only on shared threat perceptions or common economic interests. And well, as we also know very well, while often being accused of double standards, and with much variation in their foreign policies, from Wilson to Biden, US presidents, some more populist than others, and Congresses before Trump have operated on the belief that democracies possess a unique ability to cooperate. And not least, they have all shared the view that a strong transatlantic relationship and European integration is beneficial not only to Europe, but also to the United States. So we have organized the report in line with these 4 pillars. But to also try to say something about in which direction the relationship is moving, all chapters also distinguish between 3 possible future scenarios or directions in which the relationship might develop. And the first scenario is that transatlantic relations, they disintegrate or break down, and it could happen in one policy area or it could happen in more than one policy area, due to domestic challenges, but also due to changing geopolitical structural changes. But as I already mentioned, the transatlantic relationship also rests on very strong economic, institutional, cultural bonds that might help stabilize the relationship also under challenging circumstances. So that is why we also, even if the news cycle now is dominated by crisis, we also explore 2 other alternatives to this breaking down scenario. The second one is that the relationship becomes weaker, or is it hard to hear? Do I have to start again? So in the second scenario, the relationship becomes weaker, but it might be able to model through contemporary challenges based on functional adaptations in areas where this is seen as mutually beneficial. And we also allow for the possibility that the relationship could also be redefined and move forward, for example, due to external shocks like a crisis or even a war, or if a more united and stronger Europe is viewed as a valuable partner to the US. But as Jessica will come back to later, it is also possible to perceive a future where a new and redefined transatlantic relationship follows populist right-wing trends. Okay, so we can, I don't know how we, I don't have the switch for the.
They've changed.
Oh, thank you, I can see it there. Okay, so what do we then see across these 4 pillars? In what direction is the relationship going? And overall, we are arguing that we are witnessing what we in the report call nothing short of a deep and potentially durable rift between the EU and the United States. And there are many reasons, but maybe 2 main reasons why we argue this. First, today we see a weakening across all 4 pillars of the relationship. The EU, US, and Europe have faced many crises before, but the systematic changes we now see across security, across trade, across institutions and values at the same time is new. And all the chapters in this report conclude that the relationship has reached a turning point and is undergoing a significant shift. And the second main reason why we come to this conclusion is that Trump does not see the value of a strong transatlantic relationship. And this is also different from previous administrations, because across the post-war area, US presidents have consistently supported a strong transatlantic relationship, but they have also seen integrated Europe and strong relations to Europe as vital not only to European interests, but also to American strategic and economic interests. And perhaps needless to say, Trump does not share this view. And even with a different president, we do not see, at least in the foreseeable future, a return to transatlantic relations as they once were, as very likely. And this is because US domestic polarization will not simply disappear. I agree that Trump being elected 2 times with 4 years in between is not an anomaly. And shifts in US strategic focus away from Europe and Russia, whether it's towards China, as we saw under Biden, or towards the Western Hemisphere, as we saw under Trump, will not change either. And trust is easy to tear down, difficult to rebuild. And in Europe, we also know now that US foreign policies can change from one election to the next. So this is the bad news. The good news is that several of the authors also point to functional adjustments that can help the relationship muddle through, at least in some policy areas where interests align. We see some adjustments made to accommodate challenges to the relationship. One example, if it survives, is the Framework Agreement on Trade. Another is certain aspects on the defense, where increased European defense spending could indicate new defense, industrial, and other defense-related interdependencies. There are many examples in the report. And so the relationship is weaker than in previous decades, but these instances of muddling through could still lead to a redefined and different relationship over time. And not least, the good news is that we argue that Europe is in a good place to respond. When united, Europe is in many ways a superpower. And our authors underline, Europe has agency. Europe can decide how it wants to proceed, what values, institutions, and partnerships it wants to uphold. And Europe has shown, most recently in support of Greenland and Denmark, that it can be united. This is why the report argues that EU leaders must reduce risks from shifts in US policy while protecting what still works. Okay, so what does that imply in more concrete terms? Before giving the floor to Guri, let me just very briefly sum up our findings and recommendations in the security and defense domain, many of which will not come, I guess, to a surprise to most of you here, given last year's developments. So we have 4 chapters on transatlantic security and defense relations, written by Ricardo Acaro, Karolina Podmarska, and Horst Henrik Morgenstern Pomorski, Monica Sus, and Ruben Wong. And all 4 come to the same conclusion. The post-war transatlantic security relationship is entering what is referred to as a post-American phase, in which the EU can no longer rely on stable US leadership and must take much greater responsibility for its own security and defense. At best, the security relationship, according to our authors, is muddling through at the moment. Some of the authors also suggest that continued advances in European security and defense could make the EU more capable and therefore also more interesting partner for the United States in the future. But whether the relationship is able to muddle through today's challenges or not, the implications for Europe remain the same. If Europe wants to be a partner to the US in a more uncertain and conflictual world, it has to become a stronger partner. But if instead Europe is increasingly left to its own, Europe must be able to defend itself without the US. Hence the conclusion is the same, and one that many Europeans now seem to share. The EU must continue to strengthen its security, defense, and strategic autonomy. And we also see in this context that Europe has begun to improve conditions, coordination of resources and defense capabilities, both inside the EU and through flexible coalitions. But our authors argue that progress is still too even and too slow given the scale of the challenge. So they suggest that the EU needs to speed up to reduce its dependence on US military enablers, prepare for a possible weaker US commitment in NATO, and fully use its truly unique institutional, budgetary, and legal potential to strengthen member states' military, industrial, energy, and technological assets. It needs to build a strong European defense industrial base, and in doing so, invest in genuine interoperability and European capabilities. Continue to stand up for Ukraine is also a common recommendation. And it should continue to look for partnerships that help reduce its dependencies of the US. And it's also worth noting, based on some of the comments we already got, that even though this report was written before the most recent increase in tensions around Greenland, across the different sections of the reports, the authors argued that the EU should take not only a more unified stance towards Washington, but also a much firmer one. So with that, let me give the floor to Guri, who will take you through the trade and international institution sections of the report.
Thank you so much, Marianne. First of all, I think you deserve a big applause for Allow me to quickly introduce Guri. Thank you for joining us. Guri Rosin is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. She is also a senior researcher at ARENA, which is the Center for European Studies at that same university. Guri, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So, as Marianne was saying, transatlantic relations have traditionally rested on shared commitments to liberal trade principles, rules-based institutions like the World Trade Organization. And a main message coming out of the section on trade is how the rise of populism has weakened domestic support for trade liberalization, which has accelerated the shift, especially under the Trump administration, towards protectionism, unilateral tariff views, and a transactional approach that challenges core global trade norms. So in the section in the report that deals with trade, our authors have focused on the growing tension between globalization and domestic autonomy, on the China and US shocks to the international trading systems, the new upheavals following the second Trump administration, and the collapse of the WTO. So I'm going to take you through each of the chapters, so really briefly. So Eric Jones, who's based at the European University Institute, he looks at how the international trade system has developed after the Second World War and explores what he sees as the historical tension between the international division of labor and the need for domestic policy autonomy. And he describes how after the Second World War, this embedded liberalism compromise allowed for global trade while letting governments protect their welfare states. But as globalization deepened, capital flows began to overshadow trade, governments lost control, leading to domestic discontent, which we now see is fueling populist movements. And a couple of key takeaway points from Jones' chapter is that first, the importance of recognizing what we can call the control dilemma, that there is a fundamental conflict between a globally integrated economy and a government's ability to maintain national social protection. And second, also that institutions for policy coordination that was needed to manage economic interdependence, prevent national governments from using domestic policy instruments to shift their political problems onto one another, have become increasingly controversial because they now address sensitive issues of popular concern, creating this perception that critical decisions were being moved beyond the reach of democratic politics. And with Jones's chapter as a backdrop, Alistair Young from Georgia Institute of Technology, he focuses on the drastic shift in US trade policies during the second term of Trump. And he argues that Trump views trade as a zero-sum game where the EU is looted by foreigners. And with this as a point of departure, some of his main messages are the following. First, that the trade agreement between the EU and the US represents a fragile peace, as he calls it, which I guess the debacle over Greenland has showcased. And this is because the Trump administration frequently returns with further demands after deals are reached, as we know. And then his follow-up question is, what then should be the EU strategy going forward? So he argues that retaliation would likely hurt the EU's economy as much as the US's, which is probably the reason why the EU has largely chosen to wait Trump out while pursuing internal reforms. Now, the third chapter in this section looks at changes to the multilateral trading system. And Kent Jones from Babson College discusses the breakdown of the rules-based system, and Trump has essentially abandoned WTO principles, such as the most favored nation clause, has used national security exceptions to justify purely economic goals like reducing trade deficits. And this has forced the EU to consider new forms of leadership in global trade. And Kent Jones argues that what we are witnessing is a systemic rupture. So by bypassing WTO dispute settlements and imposing discriminatory tariffs, the US has violated multilateral norms it helped to establish. And this is an indicator of US instincts. US policies have shifted from being rule-based to being transactional, requiring the EU to bargain sector by sector rather than relying on treaties. And then finally, in this section of the report, Arlo Poletti from the University of Trieste examines how the China shock, the surge of Chinese imports from the beginning of the 2000s, has disrupted EU labour markets and strengthened far-right populist parties. So he claims that the EU now finds itself in a constrained bargaining position between a protectionist US on the one side and an assertive China on the other, which is made particularly difficult since the EU relies on the US for its security guarantees. But he argues that the EU should be prepared to credibly commit to retaliate in the face of a potential further escalation of the United States protectionist strategies. So there are some disagreements or slight disagreements between our authors, as you will see when you read the report. The EU should also strengthen its relations with other trade partners to diversify export markets and fully leverage its recently acquired geo-economic policy toolkit to defend its trade interests. So taken together, I think that we can see that the authors in the trade section recommend a strategy where the EU builds its own economic strength and resilience while still anchored in a rules-based system, and that the EU should keep prioritizing domestic goals, using its market power, using its regulatory tools to support growth, jobs, and security at home. And the argument is that doing so will form the core of a more competitive strategic autonomy. At the same time, the authors highlight that member states need to coordinate better to avoid sort of pushing the costs of globalization onto one another and to prevent a patchwork of conflicting national measures. The EU should also deepen trade and investment ties with partners on all continents, so it's less exposed to pressure from either the United States or China, and to be better positioned as a key player in the multilateral trading system. And strengthening supply chains, strengthening or boosting technology capacity, defense-related industrial base are essential to these efforts. And then in parallel, they argue that the EU should help keep the WTO functioning and work with others to update its rules and use WTO-compatible tools where possible. So in the short term, the authors argue that the EU will often have to muddle through the Trump period, doing sector-by-sector bargaining. But the long-term goal should be more autonomous and resilient EU economy that can both defend its interest and uphold an open, rules-based trading order. So moving on to the international institutions. Thank you. The section on international institutions examines how the rise of a right-wing populism and the America First agenda have disrupted the rules-based international order. So while the EU views multilateralism as part of its DNA, the current Trump administration characterizes international institutions as inefficient, as elite-driven, constraints on national sovereignty, which is quite the contrast. So Mike Smith from the University of Warwick, who's with us today, provides a framework for understanding the revolutionary attack on established international norms. And he argues that while the first Trump administration was constrained by a lack of preparation, Trump 2.0 operates with a far more radical and unconstrained agenda. And he suggests that the EU now faces a choice between three strategic responses: to accommodate American demands, to stand up to US policies, or to build a new resilient form of multilateralism, potentially without the US. So some key points, takeaway points from this chapter is US foreign policy has shifted towards domesticism, prioritizing immediate national needs over long-term global leadership. And this also entails an erosion of practice. So beyond attacking specific organizations, the administration has redefined diplomacy as a performative process and international law as a mere instrument of state policy. So what we're witnessing currently is a system in flux. As the US withdraws, a vacuum is created that other powers such as China are attempting to fill. We also have a chapter on the UN, and written by Edith Driskens from the University of Leuven, who explores the turbulence the UN is facing at the moment. A series of US executive orders have mandated comprehensive reviews of all international organizations and of foreign aid, leading to what can only be described as brutal budget cuts that have forced many agencies into survival mode. And this can highlight some key concerns, particularly particular organizations like UNESCO, for instance, have been singled out for defunding or membership reconsiderations. The US has ceased investing in sustainable development goals, claiming they are inconsistent with American sovereignty, and we see the same for values such as diversity and inclusion, and I guess you come back to that, Jessica. And she also argues that the EU is currently walking on eggshells, as she calls it, refraining from public criticism of the US to avoid retaliation in other areas like trade or NATO. We have a chapter on climate policy under the Trump administration by Daniel Fiorino from the American University in Washington that analyzes the consequences of the United States' second withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. And he argues that the administration has shifted from mitigation to an energy emergency posture, removing regulatory barriers to fossil fuel infrastructure and attempting to roll back domestic emissions standards. The EU, on its part, is committed to becoming the first climate-neutral continent by 2050 and must now exercise autonomous leadership to fill the void left by US disengagement. So what Fiorini highlights is that although the most profound effects may be domestic in the US, by walking away from climate diplomacy, the US risks ceding technological and economic leadership in the green transition to the EU, but also to China. And the EU's most sensible path is the wait out strategy, in his opinion, to maintain its Green Deal policies and wait for a possible shift in the US political cycle. So finally, we have a chapter on the World Health Organization by Frode Wegeland from the University of Illinois. And he focuses on the consequences of the US withdrawal in 2025. And he argues that the WTO is suffering from what he calls a turbulence of scale and also a turbulent environments as its funding is increasingly fragmented and earmarked by donors. But he also argued that the EU must now tighten its cooperation with other like-minded partners to ensure global health security and to be able to manage the post-American reality of global health governance. And what he envisions is a new role for the EU, and he argues that this can fill the US vacuum by building coalitions of the willing to advance health security as a form of soft power. So taken together, I think that the authors in the trade section would agree that the EU should approach international institutions as core instruments of European power and legitimacy. And this means, or could mean, that the EU should stop waiting for the US and instead build new or alternative multilateral frameworks with like-minded partners. So doing so would entail moving beyond a kind of wait-and-see posture to protect the EU's agency when the US support is uncertain, although some authors are a bit more hesitant here. And I guess that's something also we can discuss in the Q&A. More generally, they argue that the EU should combine adaptation, selective pushback, and long-term institutional strengthening. So the EU should adapt where necessary, when it's needed to manage short-term risks while avoiding dependency or appeasement. It should resist in targeted coalition-backed ways when core norms and interests are at stake. But over time, the EU should prioritize a reconfiguration by strengthening international rules, funding models and coalitions with like-minded states, so institutions are more resilient to funding shocks, to obstruction, and to shifting power balances.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guri. And last but certainly not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Greenberg, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois Urbana, Champaign. She is a political and legal anthropologist with expertise in the anthropology of Europe, post-socialism, human rights, social movements, revolution, democracy, and law. Her most recent book is Justice in the Balance, Democracy, Rule of Law, and the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you very much for joining us, Jessica.
Thank you so much. And just to reiterate as well, thank you to everybody here for attending. Thank you to the hosts and for the opportunity to launch this report, which was really wonderful to work on with my co-authors. So I'm going to talk about the last section, which is the democratic values section. I've titled this Moving from Muddling Through to EU Leadership. So hopefully this will be a more hopeful and forward-looking assessment of where we've come from and also where we might go. So I just want to have, if a slide changes, I don't know who's doing the slides, or, there we go, thank you. I want to start with a note on methods for this section. It's a little bit different because it's primarily influenced by the sociology and anthropology of institutions. And I think it's an important note that democracy and populism are notoriously difficult to define and practice, and yet they suffer from that sort of we know them when we see them kind of first blush reaction. And this section really digs into the meaning of both democracy and liberalism within institutions, and it also digs into populism as what we call in anthropology a life world. So really thinking about the granular aspects of these concepts, because critically, democracy and rule of law really have an everyday and practice-based dimension to them, which we don't want to lose in thinking particularly about democratic resilience. And likewise, populism itself is also a complex phenomenon that cannot be easily reduced to political discourse and rhetoric. And I just want to quote here from one of our authors, Douglas Holmes, from the introduction about populism. The unsettling premise is that populism functions as a creative force, one that can shape not only our politics, but also our feelings, thoughts, intimacies, moods, and actions, our perceptions of justice and injustice, our understanding of reality, and ultimately what we take to be human. So this section, for those who are interested, gets at some of this, as I noted, granular level. Okay. Let's see, slide. There we go. Okay, so the first two chapters by Douglas Holmes and Saul Newman lay out what I like to think of as populism's paradoxes. Again, we've talked a little bit or heard a little bit about some of the paradoxes before, and I think this really shapes the institutional and cultural landscape by which we can come up with any strong response to the populist capture of institutions. So a couple of the paradoxes that are noted across these two chapters. Populist politics is simultaneously anti-elitist, anti-establishment, and anti-institution in some ways, in many ways. And yet also, again, paradoxically, it uses institutional frameworks at the international and European Union level, as well as institutional capture at the domestic level. And I think understanding the integral way in which populist actors have, in fact, reworked, you could almost think, the genetic code of the institutions that we're all talking about and dealing with from the inside out is absolutely critical to thinking about what effective responses will be. Another paradox is that populist politics is focused on national frameworks, racialized and homogenous notions of the people, and yet that should not blind us to its paradoxically internationally networked character. And it increasingly shares, populists across the globe increasingly share strategies, repertoires, social media memes, can't forget about those, and discourses. And so there's something in practice perhaps counterintuitively cosmopolitan about the populist landscape, which we also have to take into consideration when thinking about responses. And the last paradox is that maybe paradox as such, but important finding from these two chapters is that populist politics directly challenges other political and social claims, and particularly liberal claims to represent people, provide care, solidarity, justice, and representation. It is operating as a critique of liberalism and liberal institutions. And I think, again, understanding the way in which that shapes populist strategies and relationships to existing institutional landscapes is really a critical feature of these first two chapters. Okay, moving on to the next chapter, the illiberal bargain on migration, convergence in securitizing borders, by Ruben Anderson, who's an expert in European migration policy. This is a chapter that highlights the way that migration as a so-called security problem displaces opportunities for meaningful integration, growing economies, and clear demonstration of commitments to democracy, pluralism, and rule of law. And it really investigates the kind of securitization language of migration that's shared both in the US and across Europe. So just a couple of, I think, very effective and illustrative quotes from that chapter. Anderson notes, politicians on both sides of the Atlantic converged around a two-faced migration regime, feeding migrants into their labor-hungry economies on the one hand, including illegalized workers who could be readily exploited, and launching tough-seeming crackdowns at physical borders and in third countries on the other. The result was a growing enforcement industry and self-sustaining spiral of securitization. And in this sense, migration as a security problem is in some ways standing in the way of potential strengths in dealing head-on with the relationship between migration rights and labor market needs. The next chapter, titled Illiberal International, The Transatlantic Rights Challenge to Democracy, is by Robert Benson, who joins us here today. And I just need there we go. This chapter looks at something that's come up already in a couple of the prior comments, which is really the nature of transatlantic far-right mobilization and the way in which it's profoundly networked and can't be understood in isolation, in part precisely because of those networks, right? So the Heritage Foundation showing up on this side of the Atlantic is a case in point. This chapter examines cross-border alliances that share strategies, legal models, ideological frames, and digital tactics to weaken democratic norms, the organizational links among think tanks, party foundations, and online platforms, and, in Benson's words, quote, a transnational ecosystem of distrust that corrodes confidence in electoral integrity, journalism, and scientific expertise. It is an intentional strategy. It is an organized strategy. It is highly networked. It is extremely sophisticated. And again, it requires both specific place-based responses as well as coordination, and will continue to do so. The final chapter, thank you, by Albina Asmanova, is on precarity, and again discusses precarity in relationship to the resilience of core democratic values. And this chapter, importantly, looks at the way in which precarity, inequality, social vulnerability, and the rising affordability crisis, we need probably only look out the window and on the streets outside of this institution to see some examples of that in real time, how these factors fuel distrust in government and become fertile grounds for populist grievance politics. This chapter shows, I think, in really important ways, as do all the chapters, that good social welfare policies make for democratic resilience and make also for good counter politics to populist political parties and platforms. So those are the chapters in this section, and again, I encourage you to read them and really dig in. They're very granular, they're very, very rich, and I often say to my students, the devil's in the details in this. And so I just want to pull back now with some closing remarks that speak to some of the broader implications of this section, but also tie together some of the other comments and presentations and the other sections as well. Okay, so the transatlantic alliance, as we know it, is over. President Donald Trump's most recent threat to invade Greenland means that NATO could also hang in the balance. His repudiation of multilateral cooperation in trade and security, his shunning of rule of law at home and international law abroad, and his nativist go-your-own-way politics rejects everything that storied alliance has stood for. The United States has replaced cooperation and liberal trade with zero-sum games of protectionism and tariffs. Trump's disdain for democracy and a global legal order finds common cause with populists on both sides of the Atlantic. That's the bad news. The good news is that the alliance itself was always more than a simple handshake among faceless bureaucrats. It was a living, breathing set of commitments that guided Europe and America through difficult times. The alliance provided the institutional architecture for a world governed by multilateral cooperation and trade. It offered best practices and pathways to respect sovereignty while binding national interests through common visions of peace and security. And it offered effective frameworks to link prosperity to democratic participation, human and constitutional rights, and equality. Community members from Dublin to Detroit, policymakers from Brussels to DC, human rights advocates from Geneva to New York, and entrepreneurs from Frankfurt to Chicago worked to turn abstract goals into a lived reality. As long as Donald J. Trump is president of the United States, he will continue to destabilize whatever trust is left in this 70-plus year alliance. Europe cannot afford to wait to see what might happen, to pretend this scenario is not as bad as it seems. It is. Europe must go it alone, and it must act now. We're not alone here in calling for a more unified Europe, but much less has been said about the specifics. The frameworks and lessons of the broken alliance and its original 4 pillars can continue to be a useful guide. The EU is in an excellent position to forge ahead as a leader in international cooperation, trade, security, and democratic values. To achieve this, the EU needs to continue to integrate its economic and financial policies and bolster existing coordination mechanisms, as we've heard. Our report suggests the EU must take a firmer political line and more coherent response to Washington beyond appeasement and a wait-and-see strategy. The EU has political and financial leverage, again, as we heard, and should not be afraid to use it. The US needs a unified EU to respond to growing threats from Russia and China, both at the level of security and of trade policy. This positions the EU to promote its strategic autonomy while remaining the only credible option for strengthened bilateral and plurilateral partnerships. The EU can deepen its credibility through a more coherent long-term security strategy, including a stronger European defense industrial base and more predictable support and security guarantees for Ukraine. It must do so, while also carefully managing its relationship with China and other partners. Strength, flexibility, and the courage of its convictions will be key. A unified position will allow EU and domestic actors to respond to opportunities to promote aligned interests when they arise, including with an increasingly less relevant United States. The strength of the EU can also be the strength of its member states. Our report suggests that the EU should continue to prioritize domestic policy goals and use its markets and regulatory tools to support growth, jobs, and security at home. Balancing these goals without rewarding race-to-the-bottom competitive strategies is key. This will promote and build European unity while fostering collective solutions to globalization's shared challenges, from precarity to public health and the climate crisis. The EU should likewise continue to support international institutions as central to both European interests, power, and legitimacy. And these multilateral and institutional networks ought to promote and enforce best practices grounded in rule setting, transparency, and democratic procedures and discourse. A unified Europe will be defined by reasoned action and a strong ethical core. Democracy, pluralism, and rule of law are central to this vision. They cannot be afterthoughts, nor merely technical or procedural exercises. The European Union's policies on precarity, migration, and climate have been at best backsliding and at worst capitulation to populist forces. Across the board, our report's experts argue it is crucial to combat rising inequality, the affordability crisis, and wide-scale institutional distrust if Europe is to be a democratic leader. Values on paper need to inspire faith and belief through concrete action. This means modeling commitments to the rule of law and inclusion at every level, from human rights compliant migration policies to a recommitment to urban and rural sustainability, health, and well-being. It is through more equitable and just approaches to human insecurity that Europe can serve to counter Trump's race to the bottom. It takes action and leadership to respond to American and European populist strategies that rely on fast-paced shock and awe. The rapid-fire shift in policy, flagrant disregard for legal norms, and sowing of conspiracy theories has proven all too effective in overwhelming and demobilizing citizenry. The EU will never outrun the process of destruction and destabilization. It must instead counter it with substance and endurance. This requires clear communication and vision, hope and pragmatism. Someday, America, I hope, will find its way back to democracy. If Europe acts now to uphold the promise of the broken alliance, America will have a home to which it can return. Okay, that is the conclusion, and I think now we're moving on to Q&A, is that?
Firstly, thank you very much, Jessica, for what was a really Herculean task of summarizing 280 pages of this report. A report which I think you now all gathered is a true wake-up call. So please do read it. We need, I think, and I speak for myself as a liberal Democrat, both with a capital and with a small L&D, as those in favor of liberalism and democracy, there is a time for fight back which has come. And I would now finally like to open up the discussion. I should say that I'm being told, and I from experience believe that it is true, that we have to leave this room at 4:30, and I would like to give Radan the opportunity to make some closing remarks. So we have about 15 minutes or so for discussion. Please raise your hands and introduce yourselves very briefly before you speak. And we have a first hand over there. Thank you.
I feel bad as one of the authors. Maybe I should cede the floor to somebody who... It's okay. Are you sure? Okay. I'm Robert Benson. I work at the Center for American Progress, which is a center-left think tank in Washington, D.C. We are the antithesis of the Heritage Foundation. Just two quick questions for the editors and for the panelists at large. The first is I didn't hear too much delineation between left and right-wing populism. Can populism be an emancipating political force? And can it be potentially the antidote to what we see coming from the Trump White House? There is a debate, if I put my political hat on, within the Democratic Party. Do we go the way of Mandami, or do we go the way of a more centrist candidate? That's the first question. The second question I have is a little bit more theoretical, and it gets to the MVP's remarks. Nationalism is a contradiction if it's international, is it not? So to what extent can the AfD coexist with the Trump White House, and to what extent can it coexist with an RN in Paris? And is it not better to think of it more as a means towards a common ends? And what is that common ends? From the American point of view, one would imagine profiteering, right? Corruption, money, and the demanding of a pound of flesh from a divided and conquered Europe. I think that might explain the national security strategy for those who had the displeasure of reading it like myself. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now, who would like to have a first go at these very good questions? Go ahead, Jessica.
Thanks, Maria, for throwing me under the bus there. So I suppose, I have my own sort of research and personal perspectives on the question of left-right populism, which maybe we can talk more about dinner. I think for the purposes of this report and thinking strategically about what follows, I think the important takeaway is that for whatever reason, both left and right populist political movements have inspired a tremendous amount of loyalty and actually out on the street action. And so, they clearly they're turning people out, and they're energizing and exciting people across the spectrum, but especially young people, again, both on the left and the right, to take action. And in some ways, they've captured the renewal of citizenship, right? The renewal of engagement. And I think liberal democratic institutions cannot afford to cede that kind of energy to either left or right populism exclusively. Liberalism has to inspire hope. It can't only be reactionary. So.
Thank you. It's the age-old question of how populist can you become in order to defeat populism, which can be a slippery slope, I suppose. Anybody else would like to comment?
So maybe if we gather some more questions.
We can do that. I was just thinking there was a second question on internationalism. Sure, we can keep that.
I could integrate it in the next answer to save some time for more.
All right. Well, then over to you. I think Ricardo. Okay. And you come. We take the two together.
Okay. Hello. My name is Ricardo Arcara. I'm also one of the authors, and I could not help but intervening because I do have an answer to the second question that was kept on hold. How can the AfD or any other nationalist party in Europe be on the same page with the Trump administration? Well, of course, the relationship is destined to be complicated and problematic at times. But the real issue here is that there is a common base for these parties to keep tightening the links and political ties, because they do share something very important to them, which is they have the same understanding of their enemies, of their political foes, which are mostly internal rather than external. Not in all cases, and not only internal, but this is where the convergence, the overlap area is. So basically, a transatlantic relationship driven by these parties would be de-strategized, so not so much based on strategic interests and common values, but it would be very much ideologized and politicized, because the transatlantic relationship between nationalist parties would become a legitimizing framework, political framework, to carry out their fight against migrants, globalist elites, woke leftist lunatics, liberal institutions, Islam, whatever. And so basically the transatlantic relationship would become an instrument for political legitimization of a domestic fight. And this is especially important for the Europeans.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm not sure there was a question there, but I sense a little bit of an answer to Mr. Benson's earlier question. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. I don't know, it works? Yes. Hi, I'm Christian Anastasov, and I'm forced to do a geopolitical comment because it's my domain, but I'm also a historian. First, your presentation really gives the urge to read the report. It sounds really avoiding the worst thing that we can do, and this is to sort of dive into the ideological alone. As a European, I see what Europe makes. What's the difference that we have with what we see in the United States now? We have basis of consensus in Europe that's beyond ideological division. And when you look at the United States today, you have the impression that you have two American nations, which always in history was a recipe for a civil war, nonetheless. We don't have this in Europe, despite the divisions, despite the tentative of populism. You don't have fractures beyond Hungary that leads to a rupture. And what compulsively urge us to look from that perspective is the European perspective is to be replacing in the framework that Americans are living today the United States as far as possible. As far as possible means literally restoring links that are destroyed, but also creating new ones. And from that perspective, the quite well done European answer to the crisis of Greenland is a showcase of both the positive and the negative as a possible European response. The negative is Trump started again speaking of taking over Greenland the very next day after the Europeans decided not to take over the money kept in Belgium of the Russian regime. And that is show of weakness. The Trump administration reacted immediately to that show of weakness. The strong answer was Mercosur, unfortunately spoiled by this very institution at the last moment, and the deal with India. Showing strength is the only possible answer to a deal breaker. There is no way of appeasement and no way of cohabitation if you don't show force. And Europe has the option to show force. And what it does like is a consistency in doing so. For now.
Thank you very much. Should we take a few comments on this before we move on? Would anybody like to comment? Marianne?
So, yeah. Yes, thank you. And thank you also for encouraging everyone to read the report. And I hope that, because that's what we wanted to do, we wanted to kind of analyze it, use kind of some framework, theoretical, well, at least conceptual framework to study this systematically. And we are urging, all of the authors urge Europe to be firm, be united, to respond. And now this was, of course, published or finished this fall, but I think we also, as researchers, will see a change, I think, now, for example, with Greenland, in perceptions and the ideas on how to deal with Trump. The challenge for Europe is, of course, the dependencies that are still there. So I guess the main strategy is to do what Europe has to keep the United States on board as long as it takes. Try to cooperate with the United States in taking over security and defense, because it will take some time. So it is a very difficult dilemma. And it's also this unique thinking about the Trump administration that it tends to mix security and trade, which we haven't done for like decades, right? Even negotiating trade agreements linking into Ukraine, it makes it very difficult. But I think we see some changes. I think we see changes. We observe changes from one crisis to the next, actually, when it comes to how long the EU takes to unite and come up with solutions. I mean, agreeing now that solutions must be found at the European level, and then, of course, there's a lot of disagreements on what to do because there are political differences. But yes, but when it comes to Mercosur, I'm not sure if I would comment on that. But I think also that one thing that we see is Europe is a very flexible system, super flexible. So it will be delayed. It will go through court, which might also be, I mean, from some perspectives, also a good thing. At least it will be tested legally. But it will be implemented in parts, because that's what also, I guess, something we observe when we study the EU, that it's an extremely flexible system. It seems like if there's a will, almost everything is possible, right, with the treaties. Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. Guri, you wanted to comment.
Yes, can I just add to that? Because I mentioned during my presentation of the trade section and the international institutions that there are some divergencies between the authors. Some are, as you say that the importance of showing strength, right, and really go for the leadership role, while others emphasize that it's important to wait it out. That's the retaliation is the answer. The best strategy is to wait it out. And I think it makes perfect sense that there are divergences when you look at each policy area in isolation. And you mentioned that the benefit of looking or using these 4 pillars in this report is that we see a change across. And that's what we need from the EU side or from the politicians as well, is the need to see it across all of these sectors and see what makes sense when you look at all of these policy areas together. What is in Europe's best interest when you take everything into consideration? And that's why I think it's sort of, you mentioned the external challenges, Marianne. I think there are some huge internal challenges as well in terms of getting Europe in line, coordinated across the different policy areas. That is where you see what makes sense, whether it's to show strength or to wait it out.
Indeed. Thank you. We have time for one more round of questions, and I already had 2 from Sandra and from the lady over there. Oops, and 2 more. Okay, that's the last 4 that I take together. If that's okay, please keep your questions and your answers short. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, my name's Sandra Kaduri. I was fighting Brexit at one point with Irina and Graham. I'm a communications person. My question's really about a tipping point possibly being reached in America at the moment, and are we maximizing that? And somehow articulating an agenda that can make Trump seem irrelevant and work with others. I heard that in the last COP in Brazil, there were 100 state governors and officials at the subnational level from America there. So why are we not engaging with others and making him irrelevant? And also perhaps using popular opinion a bit more and polling and actually appealing to people about who we are and who we want to be, because actually it seems that majorities are worried and do respect values and are tired of this division. So I'm wondering if we're missing some opportunities here that we should be taking advantage of.
Thank you, Sandra. Lady over there.
Hi, my name's Becky Slack. I'm a journalist and a communications consultant, and I spend a lot of time thinking about framing and narratives and how we use those to reduce polarization and protect democracy. And I was really pleased to see that framing and narrative was mentioned quite regularly in the report. And it's quite a practical question. It's like, how do you envisage taking those recommendations and actually making them real? Who do you think are the partners that we're going to need to work with in order to make that happen?
Excellent question. Thank you. I think, Douglas, you had your hand up.
Hi, my name is Radan Heinisch, University of Salzburg. Could you speak to the, you presented Europe in a very homogeneous way, sort of if Europe were united. Could you say a few words about the European divisions, particularly in Eastern and Western Europe, and the connection or the relationship to the transatlantic relationship, and what kind of angle the United States has to exploit these divisions, and what would Europe be doing about this?
Thank you. And one final question, gentleman over there. Yes, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Is it me?
Yes.
I'm Douglas Holmes, and I just want to make a quick comment. And I worked here at this institution for a decade, and I interviewed, I think, over 140 MEPs. And I scrupulously avoided saying anything about the United States of America, except in one conversation with Fred Catherwood, who was asking me about the Constitution and how it was drafted. We were talking about the subsidiarity clause, and I was answering him based on my full understanding of high school American history. But we talked at some length, and the point I'm trying to make here is that history is perverse. He was inquiring about the authors of the Constitution. I said they were all religious fanatics. They were all what we would call populists in some sense. They were all mad. And they came up in the course of 12 weeks of writing one of the most liberal documents that we have, in the world. So there's something much more perverse about what's unfolding around us, and we should be prepared for opportunities that was mentioned before. And lastly, I think the whole Trump phenomenon is about the weakness of the United States, not its strength. And that should be repeatedly said over and over again. And I hope that gives some kind of encouragement to what some of the things that Jessica was talking about and the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. Who would like to take this? Because then we need to leave a little bit of time maybe for Radan to sum up. Would any of you like to comment on any of these last remarks and questions?
I think that if we only have 3 more minutes, it would be great to hear the MEP's final words and reflections.
Radan, that means over to you.
Thank you. And okay, I'll use the couple of minutes just to try to give a short opinion of some of the last questions. Maybe most interesting was how would the nationalists around Europe get along together and with American dominance. And I would say it's a big challenge for them among themselves and not a big challenge with America. The case with the Romanian elections was somehow funny, and because the outcome was positive, it made it even more funny. But Orban tried to strongly support the far-right nationalist candidate, who was, by the way, risen to prominence by destroying Hungarian graves in Romania. So it was a bit of a misstep. As a result, Orban lost all the Hungarian minority in Romania as voters, but the Romanian right wing also lost them. They all turned massively, unanimously for the liberal, and there are no liberals. Romanian Hungarians are very conservative people and very nationalist-minded people. The same way we could expect a lot of missteps like this in the building of this nationalist, let's say, international. On the other hand, we have seen so many examples in history of nationalist leaders gladly becoming puppets if there is a stronger partner. And the Vichy France is maybe by far the most well-known example, but all throughout Europe you can see it, and what makes me rather pessimistic, so not such a funny story, and answering somehow the East-West divide question. Unfortunately, many people in Eastern Europe, and especially, let's say, use this bizarre expression, deep state representatives, because in post-communist countries such thing very much exists, are used to be puppets, and it's their idea of exercising power. They have never exercised power for themselves. They have always done it for the Soviets. And they don't mind doing it for the Americans. It's even much safer because it's far away. So to be taken from your own capital and sent to Moscow to be shot is more easy than to be sent to Washington to be shot, and more probable, for sure. So there is still a risk. And finally, I will reiterate something which is not very popular in this room, but it's very much my opinion. In order to have a strong Europe, we have to differentiate between the nationalists and populists in Europe, based on their conviction for independent Europe, and not based on whether we like them, their narrative, their style, or their ideas. Because the latter I hate it all, for sure. But still, Europe has built the culture of compromise and consensus during the centuries, in fact. But if we speak of Europe as we know it, during the last 70 years, by building a grand coalition and consensus among the socialists and Christian Democrats and conservatives, when they did cover 80+% of the political spectrum. Now, socialists and Christian Democrats together we cover much less than 50%, and together with the liberals, a bit more, tiny bit more than 50%. So when we unite, it's a small coalition. It's not a grand coalition, and it's not consensus building. The von der Leyen majority in this parliament is tiny, 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 and we saw it in the Mercosur deal. It didn't do the most important job because it split a bit on national lines, and we didn't have the majority anymore. So to have a European consensus and new levels of compromises that we need, we have to speak to the Greens for sure. And believe me, for many people in my party in Bulgaria, the Greens are full populist radicals, not for me, but for the majority of my constituents. And we have to work with those of the national and conservative forces who are not ready to be somebody's sons of bitches. And it's a very, very difficult compromise and very difficult differentiation.
Thank you, Radan. Well, a lot remains to be said, a lot certainly remains to be done. For me, the only thing that I have time for to do right now is to thank particularly our host, Radan, Kanev MEP, our wonderful panelists, Sir Graham Watson, who came back to us here, and of course the wonderful team at the ECHR, Seima, Aziz, Bulend, and Selçuk, who made all of this possible. Thank you so much.